kind of pitbull, like Sibulkova was a little bit like that to me as well.
Obviously, one of the storylines last week was Alex Eala and the massive crowds that she was bringing to Dubai. I think it was perhaps maybe more notable there because
25, it's not like, they had cell phones and everything. It was rough. Then all hell broke loose at the press conference in Forest Hills. That's when I famously said I want to be number one. Little did I know that I would, you just don't realize you're in the middle of a...
There are tournaments where the champion walks in already wearing the crown. And then there are tournaments where something stranger happens, where the biggest story on the grounds has nothing to do with the top seed or the reigning number one, and everyone inside the venue can feel it before they can explain it. And that is exactly what unfolded in Stuttgart when a teenager from the Philippines walked onto the grounds, almost by accident, and left as the only thing anyone wanted to talk about. She was not supposed to be the center of attention. She was not even supposed to be in the draw, in the first place. A withdrawal somewhere up the ladder opened a door, and she walked through it as a replacement, the kind of entry that usually gets a single line in a tournament bulletin, and nothing more. Nobody circles that name on their bracket. Nobody expects the alternate to become the headline. But that is the thing about Stuttgart that week, because within days, what should have been a quiet, forgettable entry turned into one of the most talked about storylines in the entire sport, and almost nobody saw it coming. It started small, the way these things always do. A few extra fans, lingering near the practice courts, a slightly bigger crowd than usual watching a warm-up session that normally draws nobody at all. Then it kept growing and growing until it stopped looking like curiosity and started looking like devotion. People were rearranging their schedules around her practice times. They were showing up early, hours before the gates typically filled, just to grab a spot along the fence where they could watch her hit. And once the whispers hit social media, the story exploded outward in a way tournament organizers were completely unprepared for. Long lines, packed walkways, chatter about sold-out sessions for matches that would normally be treated as a formality on the outer courts. Suddenly, a first-round match felt like it carried the weight of a semi-final, and nobody could quite explain why. Except that everybody wanted to be there when it happened, security teams found themselves managing crowd sizes they had not planned for. Staff, who usually reserve their attention for the final weekend, were suddenly dealing with logistics problems in the opening days of the event. And here is the part that made it genuinely strange, because this surge of attention was not being driven by a deep title run or a shock upset over a legend. Not yet. Anyway, it was being driven by pure anticipation. People simply wanted to see her play, to be near it, to say they were there when it started. Even veteran commentators, the kind of voices who have covered every major star for years, started admitting they had never seen quite this level of energy attach itself to a player still this early in her rise. One broadcaster, only half joking, said the young Filipino star didn't even need to win that day because the crowd had already made up their minds about her. Another, laughing, tried to play devil's advocate, arguing that her next opponent simply had too much firepower, too much experience, for someone still finding her footing on this stage. But even as he said it, you could hear the hesitation in his own voice, like he wasn't fully convinced by his own argument. So, what was actually pulling people in? Because it clearly was not just hype for the sake of hype. Analysts who spent time actually studying her game kept circling back to the same details. She's left-handed, and there is something about facing a lefty that scrambles the rhythm of even-season opponents. Angles that feel unfamiliar, shots that arrive from a different plane than players are used to defending. Her forehand draws plenty of praise, but the coaches and pundits who watched her closely kept pointing to her backhand as the more dangerous weapon. An aggressive, heavy shot that she uses to push opponents backward, off the baseline, out of their comfort zone. Combine that with her willingness to take the ball early and dictate points rather than waiting for opportunities, and you start to understand why players across the tour were suddenly talking about her as a threat rather than a curiosity. Because talent alone draws a passing glance. What actually locks people in is watching that talent collide with real pressure and refuse to crack. And that is exactly what started happening match after match. Every win added another layer to the story. Milestones that had gone untouched for years in Philippine tennis history began falling one after another. She wasn't just winning matches, she was rewriting what had been considered possible for a player from her country on this level of stage. And every time she broke through, the celebrations that followed felt bigger than the scoreline alone could explain. In one post-match interview, sitting there catching her breath, she admitted she was overwhelmed, saying she was thinking of her parents watching from home, wishing she could call them immediately, but having to wait until the cameras stopped rolling. Small moments like that, raw and unscripted, did more for her connection with fans than any highlight reel ever could. People did not just want to watch her win. They wanted to feel like they knew her, like they were part of the story alongside her. And that emotional pull extended far beyond the arena itself. Family stories started circulating, the kind that make you smile without meaning to. Her own mother, apparently, was so caught up in the excitement of a rival storyline that she casually mentioned wanting to go watch another rising star play on a certain day, completely forgetting in that moment that her own daughter had a match scheduled for the exact same time. When reminded gently that her daughter was the one actually playing that day, she laughed it off and insisted, of course, she meant she was coming to watch both. It is a small, human detail, but it says something important about how normal, how grounded this entire whirlwind still felt to the people closest to her, even as the outside world was treating her like the story of the tournament. And then there was the crowd itself, because this is where things stopped being just about tennis. Wherever she played, sections of the stadium seemed to transform entirely, filled with flags, chants, and an intensity that made neutral courts feel like home turf. Opponents noticed it immediately. Commentators pointed it out constantly. What should have been a routine, emotionally neutral tennis match instead carried the atmosphere of a player performing in front of her own hometown crowd, thousands of miles from home. For a country that had waited decades for a moment like this, that emotional investment ran far deeper than sport. She had become a symbol of representation, of possibility, proof that a pathway existed where for a long time there hadn't seemed to be one at all. People who had never followed professional tennis before suddenly found themselves checking scores, staying up late to watch matches live, texting friends and family updates in real time. Entire communities rallied behind her, not because a marketing campaign told them to, but because her story genuinely resonated with something personal. And once that kind of grassroots passion reaches a certain scale, it inevitably raises bigger questions about the sport itself. Could the pull of one player's fanbase start to influence how tournaments are scheduled? Could raw audience demand eventually carry as much weight as rankings when deciding which matches get the biggest courts and the best time slots? Online, speculation started swirling, with some fans convinced that certain events were quietly adjusting based on the attendance patterns tied specifically to her matches. To be fair, none of that has been officially confirmed, and it is important not to treat rumor as fact. But even setting the speculation aside, the conversation itself reveals something meaningful about where the sport may be heading. Tennis, like every major sport, is being reshaped by social media, by global fan communities that can rally around a player almost overnight regardless of geography. And her rise appears to sit right in the middle of that shift, whether she intended it to or not. There is something almost poetic about the fact that a player who entered the tournament as a late replacement ended up becoming the center of a conversation about the sport's entire future. In her post-match interviews, through all of it, she remained remarkably grounded. Reflecting on the moment, she became the first woman from her country to defeat a Grand Slam champion and the first in 3.5 decades to beat a top 10 player. She was asked what that achievement meant, not just for her, but for her entire nation. And rather than delivering some rehearsed, polished answer, she turned the question back around, almost shyly, saying that people should really ask the country itself what it meant. She spoke about how difficult it had been growing up without anyone from her background who had walked that same path before her, without a blueprint to follow, without someone to point to and say, if they can do it, so can I. And now, whether she fully embraces the label or not, she has become exactly that person for the next generation of players coming up behind her. Even in lighter moments, away from the pressure of match points and press conferences, you get a glimpse of why people are drawn to her. Asked about which players she leans on emotionally during stressful stretches of a tournament, she lit up talking about a fellow competitor known for her humor, someone she turns to specifically because she knows she'll get a laugh exactly when she needs one most. It's a small detail, but it matters because it shows a young athlete who understands that surviving the mental grind of professional sport requires balance, requires laughter, requires not taking every single moment so seriously that the pressure becomes suffocating. And that self-awareness, that maturity, seems to be a big part of why so many people, players included, have found themselves rooting for her success. So, where does this story go from here? Because if Stuttgart proved anything, it's that we are likely still in the opening chapters of something much bigger. She has already broken barriers that had stood untouched for decades. She has already inspired a wave of new attention toward a sport that, in her home country, had previously existed on the margins. And yet, remarkably, she remains one of the youngest rising figures in the entire sport, which means the expectations attached to her name are only going to grow heavier from here. Every tournament she enters now carries a different weight than it once did. Every match arrives with just a little more anticipation than the one before it. The question is no longer whether she belongs on the biggest stages in the sport. That debate appears to be settled. The real question now is how far this can actually go. Could she eventually climb to the very top of the rankings? Could she inspire an entirely new wave of players from regions of the world that tennis has historically overlooked? Could her name, in a few years, sit comfortably alongside the sport's most iconic figures, discussed in the same breath as legends? Nobody can answer that with certainty right now, and honestly, that uncertainty is part of what makes this moment so compelling to watch unfold in real time. What happened in Stuttgart wasn't a fluke, and wasn't manufactured hype either. It was the visible result of talent, timing, and an emotional connection with fans colliding all at once in front of an audience that simply could not look away. Whether this becomes the defining chapter of an era, or simply the loud, unforgettable beginning of a much longer story, one thing already feels certain. She walked into that tournament as an afterthought, a replacement entry buried in the fine print of the draw, and she walked out as the story everyone was talking about. And if the last few weeks are any indication of what's coming next, the tennis world may have only just seen the opening pages of something that is going to be talked about for a very long time.